Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. So I'm currently working on a review for this device here, the RG351MP, and like I had said in my initial impressions video, I was going to wait until custom firmware was available for the device before I did a full review. Well, at this point there are 4 different custom firmwares available, and as I started working on this review video, I realized that I was putting too much firmware content into this video. And so I decided to cut a majority of that firmware video out and make a standalone video that was specific to custom firmware options. And so that's what this video is today. We're just going to look at the 4 different options available and some of the things I've noticed about them. Now, none of these firmwares are in a stable release at this point, they're still being worked on, but I think there's enough there just to show you a little bit of what's available. So, if one of the reasons why you haven't bought an RG351MP yet is the fact that there isn't custom firmware available, this video is going to be for you because you'll be able to see what's available today. So I imagine this video is going to be a little bit short, but just stick around. In a day or two I'll give you a full review video as well. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So before we get too far in the weeds about custom firmware, let's talk about the stock EmuElec firmware that comes with the device. And this firmware is pretty crappy. It's not that EmuElec is crappy, it's that the Ambernic version of it is not very good. There's just a lot of problems under the hood. Now that being said, if you just want to stick with the EmuElec firmware that ships with the device, I have made a clean version of this firmware and I'll have it linked in my written guide in the video description. And some of the things I've done with this clean firmware is I've added a bunch of themes that fit with the screen resolution. I've also customized all the graphics settings so you have the right aspect ratio and colorization for Game Boy and things like that. And I've also standardized all of the hotkeys. Now you can press Select and X to enter the RetroArch menu. And you can also press Select and Y to show your frames per second. And then also select an R1 to do a save state, and select an L1 to load that save state. And maybe most importantly, you can press Select and Start twice to exit out of any game and get back to the EmuElec menu. So I'll leave a link to this in the written guide if you are interested in it. It's not going to have any game files or BIOS in it, so you'll have to add those yourself. Okay, now let's move on to custom firmware. Now like I mentioned in the intro, a lot of these are still in a beta or test phase. A good example is 351Elec. In my written guide, I'll give you a link to their beta releases, and from there you can just download the new installations file. Now the current ArkOS test release is actually available on their main page, and you can find it nestled in there with all the other devices that they support. You can download it via Google Drive or Mega, it's up to you, and it's about 3 GB altogether, so it might take a few minutes. As you're waiting, I would recommend going back to the main page and going into their changelog. And within here, you can see all sorts of notes about this particular firmware. For example, the developers have found that if you use any card that isn't a SanDisk or Samsung card, it often causes problems with the firmwares. So they recommend not using any generic or knockoff microSD cards, stick with those 2 brands. And finally, the next Linux-based operating system is the Retro Arena, and you can find this over at techtoytinker.com. If you go into the handheld corner section, you'll find the download links there as well as some descriptions about the firmware. It might give you an error when you try to download that file, just go ahead and override that error. Okay, so once you have one of these files or all 3 of these files downloaded, the next thing you want to do is unzip all 3 of them. I found that these firmwares will do the best when you flash them using the image file and not a zip file. So this is what they'll look like once you have them all complete. As you can see, the Retro Arena is almost a full 16 GB, ArkOS is a little less than 8 GB, and 351Elec is much more lightweight, it's only a gigabyte. Now you have many different ways of flashing these images to an SD card. Today we're going to use one called Rufus because that one seems to work well across the board. And this one's super easy to set up, you just hit the select button, and then pick your firmware, let's do ArkOS this time, and then go ahead and press start. It's going to ask you, do you really want to do this? And you say, yeah man, I want to do it. After that, it's going to take a few minutes to flash the image. So now would be a great time to grab a cup of tea, or coffee, or kombucha, or Arnold Palmer, or whatever you want. Anyway, once it's done, you're likely going to see a bunch of pop-ups. Just go ahead and close out of all of these folders, and then eject the SD card and put it into your device. After that, it's going to expand the partitions, and you'll be able to add all your game and BIOS files. Now I already have a lot of firmware videos that show you that whole process, so we're just going to look at performance and some of the special things about these new firmwares. We're going to start with 351Elec first. One of the special things about 351Elec is that they do everything on the front end side. So the goal is, in this main menu, you can configure all of your settings, and they've added even more settings since their last release. For example, you can now set up filters right here in the main menu. As far as I know, this is the first operating system to ever allow this. And I plan on doing an in-depth guide about the next version of 351elec when the stable version releases, but I can tell you right now the beta version is very promising. I love this idea of being able to jump through and change your filters on the fly like this, because there's some really powerful options here. Filters are a lot like shaders, which you may be familiar with, but these are a little bit more powerful. For example, you can see it has this Game Boy overlay here as well. And also, it can incorporate colorization as you see here. So these are just a bunch of different filters that I've applied. And it's pretty cool to be able to use all of these from the front menu itself. Let me show you what that experience is like on something like the ArkOS or the Retro Arena. In this one, you have to use RetroArch to get into these settings. And that's not a bad thing. I like using RetroArch, but at the same time, it does have a bit of a steep learning curve, and so keeping all the settings in RetroArch does make it a little bit more complicated for new users. So for something like ArkOS or the Retro Arena, you just have to manually go into RetroArch and then change out your video settings, for example, to add in integer scaling or to apply a filter, things like that. All those options are the same as they are in 351elec, they just require a little bit more knowledge to get them to work. And I have a guide about different handheld settings, which I'll leave linked in my video description as well, which will walk you through some of these fundamentals if you happen to not be familiar with them already. One quick note about filters is that they do come with a CPU performance cost. For example, you can see here I'm running a filter with Mario World 2, and just in the title screen I'm only getting 57 frames per second. But by comparison, if I turn off that filter, you can see the frame rate goes up to almost 60 frames per second. So for certain games, particularly the Super Nintendo games that are harder to emulate, you're not going to be able to use filters, you're probably going to have to use a shader instead, because those are a little bit more lightweight. Either way, all three of these firmwares have the exact same performance when it comes to Super Nintendo, and they all play great. Some of them may require specific emulator settings, but it is possible to get any Super Nintendo game to play at full speed with enough tweaking here. Okay, so now that I've talked about filters, let's talk a little bit about shaders instead. Back on 351elec, you can go into the advanced system settings, and instead of changing up your filters, you can change different shaders. And I've showed off a bunch of different shaders that are available over the past month, but I thought today I would show off a couple CRT shaders. These are pretty cool because they kind of replicate an old school TV, and it does add a bit of nostalgia to some of those older systems. I really like the way that Super Mario 2 looks really good with some of these shaders. It's just a shame they never made a Super Mario Bros. Game after this one. So another thing I want to talk about is Nintendo 64 emulation. And I'm happy to announce that 351elec now has a variety of emulators available for this platform, including 2 standalone emulators that are also available in ArkOS and the Retro Arena. And I found that these 2 emulators give you the best performance. For example, here's the standalone emulator that uses the Rice graphics plugin, and it's running at a resolution of 640 by 480, and although it's not possible to show frames per second on this emulator in particular, you can tell by the music that it's still running at full speed. Now, F-Zero X is a middle tier Nintendo 64 game when it comes to emulation, so I could comfortably say that anything below this is going to run well, but if you try any of those games that are harder to emulate than F-Zero, for example games like Mario Tennis, you're probably going to run into issues. And unfortunately that's just a limitation of this chipset in particular. Okay, so that's a preview of 351elec. Let's talk about the Retro Arena now. Now, the Retro Arena has been around for a while. It's actually supported on almost 50 different platforms. And Steve, who's the developer behind this firmware, is really good at breaking open new devices like this. It was pretty cool to watch on Discord when he and a couple of the other developers for these firmwares were able to crack open this device in just the first few days of its release. And a lot of the options and tools that are available in this release are the same that he made in the RG351V release. But I'm seeing a couple whiskers here on the screen, so I think it's time for a cat break. I'm happy to say that the weather is finally starting to cool down a little bit here in Hawaii, which means that Chicken has been jumping on my lap a little bit more often than usual. That being said, she didn't feel like putting her face up on the screen no matter how many times I try to call her closer to the camera. So you're just gonna have to trust that Chicken is here and she does say hello, you just can't see her saying it. Anyway, I think that's enough time for the cat break, let's get back to work. So yeah, like I was saying, Retro Arena does have a lot of different options available, and this is a good time to talk about how to mount a second SD card if you want to use that for your storage. For the Retro Arena and ArkOS, you basically just put in the card, and then just find the tool that's going to move everything over to the second microSD card. And 351elec has a similar process, but it's automated. You just put the card into the device and then turn it on. Either way, that's how you set up the second SD card on all three of these systems. Now, one of the greatest strengths of the Retro Arena is the fact that it supports a wide variety of different consoles. And it would take me an additional 30 minutes to talk about all the different systems that he has available, So instead, I recommend just going to his YouTube channel, which I'll have linked below. And he's made, I think, something like 5 different videos about this device in particular, where Steve shows off all the different systems that he has support for. So check those out and maybe subscribe to the channel as well. Either way, the navigation interface is going to be the same for all 3 of these firmwares. They all use Emulation Station as their backend. And so then you have the ability to change themes if you'd like. Both ArkOS and Retro Arena have a bunch already pre-installed. And on 351elec, they have their own online repository that you can just download the themes from directly onto the device. Now that being said, the Retro Arena and ArkOS also have Theme Master enabled, which is a different theme repository. Anyway, I know that's confusing, but you have lots of options when it comes to different themes. So I'd rest assured that you're going to be able to customize your device no matter what firmware you choose. So yeah, that's about it for the Retro Arena. Let's move on to ArkOS. One thing I should mention here is that when first booting up these devices, the developers have now figured out how to remove that rumble that usually starts when you power on the device. So I would expect to see that in all 3 of these firmwares here very soon. Now, I've done a lot of videos on ArkOS in the past, and to be honest, not a lot has changed over the past several months. If anything, I would say that ArkOS has just become more and more refined. The experience is still the same. You can get into any of your different devices. There's really good documentation on the ArkOS webpage. And really, once you're familiar with this firmware and understand how it works, it kind of just clicks in my mind. And that's one of my favorite things about ArkOS, is just how streamlined the experience happens to be. But there are a couple things that aren't quite intuitive, so let me show you some of those. For example, when using my favorite emulator with Dreamcast, which is the RetroRun32 emulator, you have to hold down the A button when a game boots in order to enable 640x480 resolution. And given the fact that this is the exact same resolution as your device's display, you definitely want to have a 640x480 picture when it comes to Dreamcast. For example, if you don't press A when you boot up a game, it's going to default to 320x240, and it looks like hot garbage on this device. The text is basically illegible. It is going to give a tiny bit of performance dip when it comes to the system, but this device has never been able to play every Dreamcast game at full speed anyway. I honestly think the Dreamcast performance that we're seeing here, which is the same as it is on the other firmwares, is pretty dang good. And I'm very happy that this same emulator works on all 3 firmwares. So if you're going to play some of the harder to emulate games like Tennis 2K2 or Dead or Alive 2, I would expect some slowdowns. And unfortunately, this emulator also won't show frames per second, but it's kind of easy to hear in the sound when there is some slowdown. I think as long as you don't expect perfect Dreamcast performance, you're going to be pretty happy with how this performs. And there are a couple tricks you can do to make performance even better. For example, I would recommend using the PAL version of any of these games, because a lot of them will give you the option to run the game at 50Hz instead of 60Hz. And that's going to make it much more likely that those games are going to play at full speed. For example, you can see here Soul Calibur is playing perfectly at 50Hz. So definitely something to think about as you're building a ROM library for this device or for any other RK3326 device. Okay, since we already talked about Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, let's touch a little bit on PSP. And across all 3 firmwares, the PSP performance is exactly the same. I would say about 50% of the catalog will run fairly well. You may have to try out various settings. For example, with Soul Calibur here, I'm running it with a 30 frames per second limiter, which means that it won't run any higher than 30 frames per second, but at that point it will run at full speed, and it looks pretty good. Now if you try that same trick on a game that's harder to emulate, something like Outrun 2006, you're going to get terrible performance. Now this game is notoriously hard to run on this chipset, so I wouldn't expect much. But another thing you could do is add a single frame skip. But as you see, it will run at 100% speed, but the action is so jerky that it's just not worth playing. Meanwhile, if you try a different game with those same settings, sometimes it'll look pretty good. For example, Mortal Kombat Unchained doesn't look too bad here. So it's going to take some experimentation no matter what firmware you choose, the performance is going to be the same. Okay, let's talk about game streaming for a minute. Now I already did a video about Moonlight, but one thing I do want to show is that the best settings that you can do for this are to change the platform to RK, and then set it to 60 frames per second. That seems to give me the best performance and the least amount of lag. In general, I've been using Moonlight to stream other emulators, things that aren't going to play on this device natively. For example, GameCube runs really well on this device. It does take a little bit of tweaking to get working perfectly, but if you watch my Moonlight video, I'll show you how to set all that up anyway. And I don't know, there's something about the fact that you can play all these games that aren't meant to be played on this device on the device, and I love that concept. That being said, because this device doesn't have internal Wi-Fi, you're going to be stuck with this Wi-Fi dongle you see up top, but honestly, I kind of just got used to it. In general, I would stick with consoles that played at a native 4:3 aspect ratio. In particular, I think that GameCube and PlayStation 2 are probably the best systems to run with Moonlight on this. If you try something more modern, say with a 16:9 native aspect ratio, it's going to look really squished on this device. So my recommendation is stick with GameCube and PS2 and you're going to have a great time. Okay, so in addition to game streaming, there are other uses for that Wi-Fi dongle. For example, with these latest releases for the RetroArena 351elec and ArkOS, all three of these now have over-the-air updates, which means that you can go into the settings and update the firmware wirelessly via the Wi-Fi dongle. And that's a super handy feature that is now available on all three of these Linux-based firmwares. But if you remember, I talked about 4 different firmwares available for this device. So now let's talk about the last one available, and that's going to be 351 Droid. Now to find this firmware, you got to jump into the Retro Handhelds Discord server, and they have links for it within there. And I'll provide all those links in the written guide as well. And as you may have guessed, 351 Droid is an Android-based firmware available for these devices. It's a special version of Lineage OS, which is Android 11. And they've made a lot of great improvements to 351 Droid since the last time I made a video about this firmware. For example, it now can read the second SD card in the device. So I literally just left my ArkOS microSD card in the second slot, and it was able to read and run all of the games that I had on that SD card. So for example, I sideloaded this Nintendo 64 emulator, and then pointed it to the second microSD card, and all of a sudden I'm playing Nintendo 64 games. Now that being said, it's kind of a work in progress. For example, the left analog stick actually gives me the opposite directions, and it is super hard to play F-Zero when you have to hit left for right and right for left. And these are things that are probably easily going to be fixed in the future, but I did want to give you a heads up that there are some bugs with this firmware. Now one of the main draws for me is the fact that this can run Android games. But unfortunately it's not as great as you might think. For example, Dead Cells does play on this device, but it plays at such a low resolution that the text is basically illegible. So it's not quite as fun as you might be thinking it would be. Okay, so wrapping things up here, let me summarize real quick what I think about these 4 different custom firmwares available for the RG351MP. Now this isn't meant to be a comparison or which one is better than the other, but really just to better define which one might be best for you. And if I only had 1 or 2 words to describe each of these firmwares, these are the choices that I would make. Number 1, I would say that 351elec is very user-focused. It seems like everything they develop and every improvement that they make is specifically made with the ideal user in mind. Instead of adding something because they think it's going to be cool or whatever it happens to be, they add it because they think it might be cool for the user. And that's a really cool frame of mind to be in, and that's one of the things I appreciate most about 351elec. Now, the RetroArena I would classify as a clown car, and I say that in the nicest way possible. What I mean by that is when you first jump into the RetroArena, it seems like any other firmware, but as you start peeling the layers of the onion, as you start pulling the clowns out of the car, you realize that there's a million of those clowns in the car. And this firmware is just deceptively powerful. It's not quite as polished as some of the others, but you can definitely play some games that you would never be able to play on the other 2 systems because they're not even supported. And so in that sense, the RetroArena is really strong when it comes to that. So if you're the kind of person that wants to get any and all systems to work just because you can, the RetroArena is a really good fit for you. Now I would classify ArkOS as being very reliable and agile. And what I mean by that is the fact that ArkOS has been around for almost a year now at this point, and I've consistently seen new improvements to the firmware almost every week. The developer just continues to expand his support for a bunch of different devices, and every time he makes a new update, it seems to work just out of the gate. And that's pretty cool. And much like the RetroArena, which ArkOS is forked from, it uses the Ubuntu Linux backend, and that gives developers and enthusiasts access to a powerful set of tools right out of the gate. And finally, I would classify 351 Droid as a proof of concept. As it stands, a lot of the features I was hoping to find in 351 Droid are now working on this firmware. Things like mouse mode or access to the second SD card slot are super awesome. The real issue is this device really isn't powerful enough to run Android well. So while it's cool that it does exist, I just don't find myself using it very often. But if you really like using Android, you might find this a lot more useful than I did. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I know I said it was going to be a short one, but apparently I was totally lying. Because like always, I have to jump into all the details every time I get into a video. Either way, if you were wondering about the different custom firmware options available on the RG351MP, I hope this video was helpful. At the end of the day, all these firmwares are really important in their own right, and I really think the best way to approach this is to just grab a couple different SD cards and try each one yourself, because you might be surprised which one you like the best. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!